Welcome to the Cyber Insights Podcast, brought to you by the Greater Washington, D.C. chapter of ISACA. I'm your host, Jim Wiggins, joined today by my co-host, Mr. Altan Bulut. Our guest is Miss Katherine Scott, and we'll be discussing with her the topic of the evolution of IT governance in the digital age. Let's get into the episode. In today's episode, we explore the evolution of IT governance in the digital age. IT governance has transformed significantly over the years, especially with the rise of digital transformation, cloud computing, and AI. Strong IT governance is no longer just a compliance necessity, it's a strategic advantage that enhances security, operational efficiency, and business resilience. Joining us today is a true expert in IT governance, Ms. Katherine Scott. She is the Vice President of the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter and has extensive experience in IT security, governance, certifications, and the information assurance lifecycle. Katherine has held leadership roles at major firms including IBM, PwC, NTT Data, and Blackboard, and has been at the forefront of integrating IT governance into both the public and private sectors. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're super excited to have you here. Altan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jim. Very excited to have Katherine on this episode.
Thank you, Altan.
Absolutely. Hey, Katherine, I thought let's start by talking about your career journey. You have an impressive background spanning programming, consulting, and leadership in IT governance. What first drew you to this field?
Oh, that's a good question, Jim. I actually started my interest in math and science very young. I actually went to an engineering camp when I was in middle school and went to that camp for 5 summers and ended up pursuing a degree in computer science in college. And then essentially I grew up as a computer programmer, if you will. I was involved in all stages of the software development lifecycle, mostly programming, but testing, requirements, design, the full thing. Then I moved to consulting and worked on some really large re-engineering efforts at several federal agencies in the late 90s and early 2000s. And security at that time, as you know, was very much of an afterthought, or didn't even happen unless there was an issue and then we had to react to that issue. Slowly, though, organizations began to focus on security and they integrated controls with DevSecOps, and my focus shifted to IT governance and control implementation. With that shift, I was encouraged by my manager to get involved with ISACA and pursue some of the professional certifications, at which point I got my CISM, which is the Certified Information Security Manager. And I got my CGATE, certified in the governance of enterprise IT. And I also have my CRISC, which is a risk management certification. Those are all ISACA certifications. And I became passionate about the work that I was doing with the security and with the organizations that I was supporting and the control implementations that we were doing. And I got very involved with ISACA. I joined the board in 2014. And I'm proud to say after 11 years, I'm now the chapter vice president, as you mentioned.
Awesome. So, hey, I know you've worked with a number of different players in the space, IBM, PwC, NTT Data. We talked about that part of the intro. Can you talk a little bit about how those experiences have shaped your approach to IT governance?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I really got involved with the IT governance and security at IBM. Much of my background is focused on the security and regulatory compliance components of governance. I was involved in a very large SOX effort during the restatements when there were lots of issues in that area. And then IBM took the security very seriously, and they made an investment to build a set of internal controls that had to be implemented on 2,000 projects that were in my practice. And so I led the team to support these projects, to implement and monitor the key controls, essentially establishing somewhat of an IT governance structure for each of those programs. And those controls were based on NIST and ISO standards and COBIT. It was certainly an undertaking, but I think seeing IBM's investment and their commitment to that IT governance structure and those controls impressed upon me the commitment that is needed at the top of an organization for IT governance to be adopted and effective.
Got it. You know, I think what you just suggested, or we're talking about, really suggests that, IT governance is obviously really critical in both the public and the private sectors. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on its role in organizational resilience, I mean, a big area today is digital transformation. And how does an organization try to address those considerations during some kind of transformational process?
Right. Well, both, like you said, it's both public and private sectors that are, tending to are increasingly relying on technology to drive efficiency, innovation, and certainly customer engagement. They're looking at governance structures, which are essential to promote the technology and make sure that it aligns with their business objectives. It minimizes risks and promotes long-term sustainability. It's key, I think, whether or not you are looking at a private sector company or a large federal agency. As the business strategies are evolving, for instance, as you mentioned, AI, cloud security, the technology strategy must support that growth. So it's an ever-evolving process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How about changes that you're seeing? What are the biggest shifts? I know you've been in the industry for a while. How do things look today as opposed to 1 or 2 or 3 decades ago?
Right, which is about how long I've been in the industry. And we've seen major changes over those decades. I mean, as you know, certainly in the early 90s, our focus, especially in IT, was, making sure our systems worked and then keeping things up. And we had to we wanted to keep the systems up and running, and that was our key focus. And if, there was a problem, we'd go down to the computer room and figure out what was happening, do our backups and all that. And so our focus was just keeping things up and running. And now security, we were focused on, some user management, access management, certainly, but there wasn't much more than that. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have cloud. We didn't have artificial intelligence. So, and there was a lot less regulatory oversight. I mean, certainly since that time, too, we've had HIPAA, SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley, all of that has come into play. And so there's a lot more focus, and we have to take a step back and look at our strategies and really look at the big picture and not just keep things up and running. The strategies have grown to align with the business needs as things are changing and people are adopting, and it's a rapidly changing environment. I mean, look at AI and even the advancements we've made even within the last year for AI and how much it's being relied upon. You go to, even when ISACA does some of our events, we will rely on AI to help us write the intro to the conference or a description, and it's a good starting place for us. And so people are, relying on it more and more. And it's important that organizations look at that, and they have to figure out how to, revise their strategies and take advantage of the technology, but also mitigate risks, protect their data, stay compliant with the regulations, and all while embracing that latest technology.
I think Altan wanted to ask you a couple questions.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. So, Katherine, with your experience and what you've observed in your career, so would you say, in terms of organizations' approaches to their governance strategies, do they tend to take more of a reactive approach to the environment shifting all the time, maybe the disruptive technologies challenging the way they used to do their work, and then maybe new regulations coming all the time and maybe completely changing what they require from certain businesses? Or do you see a substantial amount of governance strategies being proactive before certain changes being implemented based on what they estimate the environment will look like in the near future? So do you see any trends overall, how organizations tend to go about their governance strategies and how they operationalize some of their control frameworks?
Well, that's a great question. We are seeing a trend in that. I do feel like for a very long time we were reactive, and we didn't know what to expect. And, we had something break, or somebody was able to penetrate the system, or even insider threats, and we were reacting to all that. But as the technology has evolved and there's so much more out there, and it's rapidly changing, I feel like companies have been much more responsive and much more, and are becoming proactive, and they're turning that around. And I think it is a key factor in being successful, I think, in this day and age, is to be proactive and anticipate what's coming. And and we're learning a lot, and there's the data-driven approach where we've got so much data on our hands, and we can analyze it, and it's live and in real time, and we can look at what's going on and be more proactive in prepping those strategies and trying to respond and anticipate to what's coming. And I think corporations have also gotten much more sophisticated with their risk management. There's a lot. Yeah. Fortunately, there's more resources, both people and money being put towards those. I mean, there's definitely resistance to it. I know the one big project I was on at IBM, some of the individual project managers would say, well, I don't want to pay for that. It's like the homeowner's insurance. People don't want to pay for it, and then there's this problem, and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, I wish I had paid for it. And there's been a definite shift, I'd say, in the last decade or maybe even 2 decades to be more proactive and to recognize that we do, companies have a lot of data, and they realize the risk of that being exposed or, other parts of their organization. I think they are taking a much more risk management approach. And so to your point, being proactive.
Yeah, so because, there's this widespread perception that compliance requirements or maybe regulations tend to play catch up all the time. Like when there's a new technology like AI and nobody knows like how it's going to impact things, and then a lot of governments or maybe regulatory bodies try to come up with sensible requirements or some compliance frameworks that will be applicable across the board. But then that tends to come after a brief period of time, maybe when the technology has already become widespread, so that becomes reactionary from the regulatory body's perspective too. So the point is that, like, do you see the successful ways that organizations can maybe stay ahead of that, like before a regulation comes in? Can they find themselves like they're already compliant with 99% of the requirements before it even becomes a requirement? So in terms of, do you see a reliable way for organizations to have their processes or maybe strategies in a way to allow that type of dynamic environment, especially with large organizations? I assume that might be more difficult for...
Right. No, you're right. I mean, that is a challenge, certainly. And I think, to your point, I do think regulations and the federal response to some of it tends to lag a little bit. But I think if you get the right people in the room, and I think it's really important to involve key stakeholders, I do think the large organizations are making every effort that they can to stay ahead of that, and because their main interest is themselves and their product or their industry or whatever it is that they're working on, and they want to protect that. And I think they've got bright people that are working on it, and to your point, hopefully they've caught 99% of it before a regulation comes out. But, involving all the key stakeholders and really stepping back and looking at your risks and doing that analysis and trying to come up with your internal strategy supported by policies, procedures, and certainly then communication. I mean, that's the other big thing, right? IT governance can't happen in a vacuum. They develop those strategies and hopefully are ahead of the game in terms of, like, you said with AI, the latest technology, everybody is kind of catching up because it's happening really, really fast. But, in addition to having your strategy around it and making the decision on it, you also just then need to make sure that gets communicated out to everybody in the organization, right? It's important for everybody to understand what the business strategy is, what the governance strategy is, and then also to understand what their role is in it.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so let's get into the core of today's discussion, right? So how IT governance is evolving in the digital age. Katherine, from a practical standpoint, what does the evolution of IT governance really mean?
Yeah, well, I think the most important criteria for successful governance is certainly leadership and support from within the organization. I think from a practical perspective, the evolution of IT governance, one of the key components of that is to remain agile and flexible. And you want to evolve, but you need to be realistic about it as well. And so I think practically speaking, it's similar, to our old method of software development, the waterfall life cycle. We were very methodical in our approach, but with technology and with the competitive landscape, organizations move to DevSecOps and continuous development, and we're doing the same with our governance. We need to be able to respond and leverage the new technologies and changing customer demands. We also need to ensure, as Altan had mentioned, the industry regulations and then securing our infrastructure and data. But Jim, from a practical perspective, I think you touched on this earlier. We've got to have a tone from the top. At IBM, it was really important for the organization and for everybody to understand how it's supported, and that the top level management was putting an emphasis on it, making the investment in it, so everybody else embraced it. Did that really answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it did. Sure. I was just, because, governance is an interesting thing, especially in the IT world. It's kind of a subset of corporate governance. Right. And so I think organizations sometimes are challenged to figure out how does it fit in the broader context. And so I'm just wondering, I know ISACA is a big proponent of this idea that, alignment is so important, right? Making sure that, ultimately your IT assets are supporting business operations and things along that nature.
Right.
And I guess I was just wondering if there was this particular, change that's happened over the last couple of decades that you've seen relative to governance and how it's evolved relative to it. Okay, so let's get into the next area, and that's talking about some of the key components. Can you break down some of the key components in modern IT governance frameworks? How would they differ from maybe some of the older traditional approaches that might have been used previously? Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say traditionally, as we were talking about, again, kind of that analogy to the software lifecycle, was very methodical and thought through, and we do these long planning processes. And the more modern governance frameworks they move more quickly because they need to move with technology as the technology is changing and your business is changing, right? Your business needs, your customers are changing, customers' needs are changing, and we've got to be continually reacting and not reacting, I guess that's not the right word, but continually responding to that. And so the IT governance needs to stay, and the strategies there need to stay aligned with what the business strategies are. Again, I think flexibility and being able to respond to those organization needs is really important. We need to be proactive, as Altan had mentioned, rather than reactive. I know in my early years of development, we wouldn't necessarily identify a problem or identify that there even was an issue until we had an error or somebody was able to penetrate the system. And I think we've built in a lot more continuous monitoring. There's risk management's really gotten a lot more sophisticated, and it is part of the IT strategy. And I think it's a full life cycle, and it's a constantly moving and evolving life cycle, and we're analyzing things. We have the ability to do that, right? Especially with AI now. We have volumes and volumes of data, and we can analyze that data so quickly with AI. And I do see that happening in the near future, right? As being able, and it's happening, I'm sure now, being able to leverage the data that's available to us to be more responsive and more proactive in our changing and updating our strategies.
It's almost as you mentioned that, I was thinking about how, we've almost seen kind of different phases, right? We've seen the traditional governance, and in the last probably decade, we've seen kind of more of an evolution of governance with a lot of the frameworks like the NIST frameworks and the COBIT frameworks. But now you're even talking about yet another generation of governance that's coming now with AI that we're trying to figure out how to incorporate with that big data model that you're discussing. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I do see either those old frameworks are going to need to change, like ITIL and COBIT, or there is going to be a new one. And it'll be really interesting to see where that goes, because just to respond to AI and, and all the new technologies and the constantly changing environment, you can't. I was on a large COBIT implementation at an institution, and it was very, methodical, and we were going through each control and talking about, does it apply, does it not? And there's going to need to be more of a rapid application, probably assessment of each of the controls to see if they apply.
So I want to put you on the spot and ask you a philosophical question.
Okay.
This is just coming from the discussions we're having. A lot of the governance frameworks today, in fact, none of them actually address AI.
Right.
There aren't, like in the NIST world, there aren't necessarily AI controls. I see two possible paradigms evolving. One of them where the frameworks get updated to try to address the need to articulate artificial intelligence, maybe quantum, whatever else is coming next. But then there's the other idea where maybe rather than looking at it as a kind of a separate carve-out that gets put into the framework itself, you just realize that it's another piece of technology that
Right.
you inherit all of your traditional controls around access control, whether it's, change management, whatever. Do you have any thoughts on as these frameworks evolve, what would be the ideal, which of those two situations to go with? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think the latter is ideal, right? I think it would be good if we could develop a set of controls that are so flexible that they could move to any technology. I do think there's going to be some changes because there are going to be some controls that may not apply anymore, right? But there are ones that will always apply: separation of duties, risk management, incident management. I mean, those are the types of controls that you need to continue to have regardless of what your technology is, right? They should, so hopefully we can, to go to your point, there won't be one that's carved out specifically for AI, but I do think the ones that are there are going to shift, and it will evolve into maybe a newer version of them, but that they'll be more comprehensive, but also more flexible in the fact that they can be somewhat kind of in a black box and transparent of whether it's cloud or AI or, back to the old GUI programming. I mean, there's, because the other thing is a lot of companies still have a lot of their legacy systems. And so, and that's one of the challenges. You're going to be in an environment where you've got, especially the large companies, right? They're going to have legacy systems that most likely have been fairly customized for their needs, but they work, so no one wants to touch them, or it's too expensive to replace it, right? So they're going to continue with their payroll system or whatever system it is, and you're going to have that, but then they also want to embrace the new technology. So hopefully the big frameworks out there will grow, but also become more generic such that it can be applied, and we don't have to be constantly significantly changing them. I think there's always going to be changes. I think that's the advantage, right, with anything that we do, is to be able to continuously grow, learn from what went well, what didn't go so well, and where do we need to move.
That makes a lot of sense. I do want to, I'm going to turn it back over to Altan in a second, but I do want to ask one more follow-on question. Mm-hmm. This is on the list of questions that I did send you ahead of time was, and it kind of correlates to what we're discussing. So it's, I think, a good thing to bring up. So a lot of organizations are dealing with digital transformation, and I know it's really impacting governance strategies. That kind of alludes to what we discussed. You could say that AI is an element of that as it's a new piece of technology that evolves. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that organizations are facing when they're integrating governance into their digital initiative? So, again, going back to what we discussed, AI being an initiative, how do we then incorporate the governance artifacts into that type of initiative?
Could you repeat the question? I'm
sorry.
Yeah,
sure, absolutely. So it's just it's kind of dovetailing with what we were discussing relative to the use of new technology. But a lot of organizations are focused on, some kind of digital transformation. Maybe they're moving from a physical, a bunch of paper, and they want everything to be digitized. Right? They got to figure out how they're going to manage all of that kind of stuff. I guess the question is, from a governance perspective, when organizations take on any kind of new digital initiative that's out there, what are the not the touch points, what are the hot button issues that they're potentially running into with where they need to be thinking about how their governance framework needs to adapt? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're talking about how it would adapt as they're changing their
correct
environment.
Yeah, exactly. Any thoughts? I mean, I'm sure you worked in environments where, you had to build a new governance framework out.
Right.
You didn't have a governance framework, so you had to ultimately adapt to what was, not only where you're at, but also where you're trying to go. How do you merge those kind of worlds together?
That's a good question. I think that, again, I think it goes back to just, you've got to be constantly analyzing your environment, what makes sense in your environment, what makes sense for you may not make sense for even the same type of company delivering the same type of product or service that you are. But you need to look at your culture, and you need to look at kind of what your current state is, figure out where you're headed, and that strategy needs to be developed or evolved to help you achieve those goals and get to where you want to be. And I think that's where it's important to look at look at your current state. Look at what your risks are. Your risks may be different than a company, again, of a similar type company, but you may have a physical risk that may not be present for somebody else, or you may have a staffing situation, or some of your legacy systems are different. And so you need to look at those, get the key stakeholders in place, look at your current governance structure, or you may not have one, as you said, and you need to develop that. And then again, train the staff, communicate it out, make sure you've got buy-in, from all levels, because that's the way it's going to be successful.
Makes sense. Altan?
Sure. So, Catherine, I was wondering, when you're looking at at an organization that has a governance framework established or claims to have one in the first place, so how do you go about trying to identify if there are any significant gaps or blind spots in their governance strategies, or the way they operationalize some of their controls around the implementation of that strategy? So an organization might have a framework that they think is functional and is working, but from the outside it may not look that way, from the point of view of an objective observer, maybe an independent observer, like an auditor point of view. So what is your favorite approach, if it makes sense, to try to identify and pinpoint those gaps and maybe communicate them to the control and process owners, if it makes sense?
Right. And so as far as a favorite, I think I would say it depends. What I have seen work well is, if you don't have the resources in-house to do it, and I think in all likelihood you may not, and also I think even if you do, as you said, they may think that it's in a good place, but it's often when you're kind of working in that system or working in an environment, you can't see the bigger picture, right? And you can't necessarily see what you're missing. I think we're all, not guilty of that, but we're all, it's just kind of nature, right? You're going to see what's in your world, and you tend to not see what may be missing from that world. So we've been brought in, or I have been brought in as a consultant to, again, a large organization. And so we were doing a several month analysis and meeting with key stakeholders, and we were using COBIT as our framework. There are other frameworks out there, but I think it's good to look at industry standards, industry best practices. And even if an organization decides to do it internally, I think they need to be able to step back, not get defensive about what they have, but to step back. So either hire somebody or be able to look at it with kind of clear glasses and be able to really assess what you have, where you want to be, and what are those gaps. And then meeting with the appropriate stakeholders to confirm that your understanding really is what you think it is, right? You may have a structure in place on paper, and it's not even what's happening in practice. So you could have a great IT governance structure, but it may not. You may think it's working, but it's interesting to get the perspective, and necessary to get the perspective of the stakeholders to make sure that's happening, and then to figure out where those gaps are, and then look at what's going to take to implement those. And you're also going to have to prioritize it, because most likely you're not going to be able to implement all those gaps at once, or even at all. Or you may decide that a particular thing is so low of a risk to you that you may decide that you're not going to implement that control or whatever. And I think the same even goes for technology too, right? With AI or with some of these other evolving technologies, an organization needs to look at it and think, does this make sense for us right now? And again, that's something you need to revisit, right? Organizations take it and revisit their strategies. It's even with the ISACA board, we revisit our vision and our strategy every year. And so it's good to continually revisit those, and organizations need to do that as well, because your world around you has changed, and you've got to make sure that you're still focusing on the right things and prioritizing what you need to be.
So have you noticed any effective strategies in terms of communicating that, maybe approaches in terms of how to effectively persuade the other party, maybe scenario-based approaches, the worst case, if this goes wrong, this would happen, maybe to get a better buy-in. Like in the technical IT security field, you have the penetration testing or red teaming approach.
Right.
You show like what could go wrong in real time, and then it's like in your face. Like
Right.
here's what could happen, and then that has the like psychological effect in terms of like making people realize, hey, if I don't do something, this could be much worse, and
Right.
we'll be in trouble. Like, how do you like? Is there a way to maybe have a parallel approach in the governance world? Like, for example, you have your key controls not even defined in a way to address some risks, like maybe separation of duties, let's say authorizations or any kind of like process-based controls. Like that may not be expensive to implement or even operationalize. So what do you think some of the more successful ways to communicate and maybe get buy-in for those like changes that people need to make?
Right. I think what you were talking about maybe is more of like a scare tactic approach, right?
Yeah,
A little
maybe,
bit. But I feel though part of it is you need to know your audience too, right? It depends on if you're talking to the CEO or are you talking to the low-level IT, not low-level, mid-level, your IT, the operator type person. And I think there's different ways to handle it for different people. I think for CEOs, often, you do a quick cost-benefit analysis, and you say, okay, if I implement this, it will cost this much, but here's the benefit. And those benefits could either be financial or sometimes they may be intangible. But making sure that you understand first who you're talking to and what's keeping them up at night and how it's going to resonate most with them. And, if you're talking to some of the IT folks, they may see what you want to try to implement is maybe kind of weakening their job security, right? So you may need to handle that different. And when we've done consulting projects, we've certainly done I was involved in a really large re-engineering effort, and we were doing a whole IT transformation. But with that, we were also doing an org structure change. And so a quarter of the work we were doing was change management and knowing the different audiences. And so you've got the C-suite audience, you've got your workers, mid-level management, and we had different strategies and approaches as to how we were going to handle each of those changes with each of the different groups and how it gets communicated. But with that, I will also say the most important people, again, to get buy-in from and support is going to be that really senior management, because they'll be able to influence and all their teams and their staff. And if they don't have buy-in on what you're doing, it's going to be really hard to be successful.
So do you find people mostly get buy-in more easily with the allure of some benefit, or the concern about something being lost or maybe compromised, in terms of what you've observed over the years?
I have observed that it depends on the person. I think there's a good number of people that are in the what's in it for me camp, right? And they do want to know what's the benefit and how will this make my job easier, or what can I learn from this? Will I get some extra training? Can it help me grow in my career? Can I start doing something that I wasn't doing before? But I also know I've dealt with people that are very scared, probably, intimidated by some of the changes. And so they're more concerned about how is it going to impact their job? Are they going to need to learn something new? Yeah. And some people see the learning something new as a good thing and they're excited about it. And then you get people that are happy with the way things have been moving for the last 10 or 15 years, and they're of the opinion, why do we need to change it? It works. And so again, I think you have different strategies to approach different types of groups.
Yeah. My thinking was more about if we don't change things, we might be in trouble type of concern. Because, in psychology, there's this loss aversion bias that a lot of people have, like almost everybody to some extent has. Like, people tend to weigh what they stand to lose much more than what they stand to gain, like in terms of proportionality, like maybe twice as much in a lot of cases.
Right.
If you were to ask people like how much happier would you be if you were to gain $5 versus how much worse off would you feel, like what would you be if you were to lose the same amount of like $5? they tend to rate losing twice as much in terms of the intensity.
Right.
So that's why I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of like when people hear about like a cyber attack that resulted in $100 billion of loss. Do you feel that has a bigger motivator in terms of like what we need to change as an organizational structure or maybe approach to cyber risk management, let's say, compared to the potential gain of the same amount of money being saved or maybe not wasted? I mean, in terms of like the persuasion or communication of that.
Right. That's a great point. I mean, certainly I think just with all the news stories, that crop up on a regular basis with data leaks and who has access to data and that kind of thing, I do think, I agree with you that people definitely react much more strongly to thinking that their data's been exposed.
That visceral feeling.
Right. It's a violation.
Yeah.
It's a violation. And you're right. People react to that. I have seen people react to that much more strongly than, like you said, gaining the $5, right? Because they want to, everybody has that natural instinct protection, right? They want to protect themselves. So, and so certainly, again, getting that back to IT governance and the changes, again, I think a lot of it is in the messaging. So I think it's just important, but it's important to remember the people and the human component to any of those changes that you do and not leave it. Because most of us have been in a situation where, you get the memo or you get something and it says, this is what's happening. And everybody's even to this is our new timesheet policy, right? And everybody's immediate reaction is, well, this isn't how we've done it. That's not how I want to do it. Or this is how it impacts me. And so I think a lot of it is in how you deliver that message and get people to embrace why that change is happening.
Makes sense. Totally.
So, hey, Katherine, I'd like to maybe shift gears a little bit as we're kind of moving into another segment. And that is really talking about kind of the future outlook and emerging trends. Can we talk a little bit about how you envision or see emerging technologies? We've talked a little bit about AI already.
Right.
But, there's a whole bunch of other technologies out there. There's cloud computing, which changes the paradigm in terms of how information is stored. There's IoT devices out there today. There's quantum. I've even reading futurists anticipating nanotechnology as being a thing in the coming decades. How do you think all of these kind of radical changes that are occurring are reshaping the IT governance frameworks that are out there and the processes that organizations are adopting? Any thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, I think you've pointed out a lot of good things. It isn't just AI. There are constantly new technologies. And to your point, I think there's things that will come out in the next 10 years that we can't even envision. I mean, certainly Altan's younger than you and me, but if you had told me 20 years ago, right, that we were carrying out around a very, very powerful computer in our pocket every single day, and, you feel paralyzed when you leave home without your phone, right? So things are going to change. I mean, they're going to continue to change. There's things we can't even envision that are going to change. But the governance, you were to ask how the governance would change?
Well, just how do you think all of this is going to eventually affect the frameworks themselves?
Right. I mean, the frameworks need to be there. I think it's important to have the strategy. It's every companies will always embrace their business strategy. Certainly, I think in our lifetime, we've seen IT strategies are equally as important, and people acknowledge the importance of them. It was a struggle, I think, there for a period, and security was a struggle there for a period. But I think that as those new technologies come in, again, it's just that continual look that we need to be taking and figure out how does this new technology fit into the strategy we have? What do we need to change? How does it need to change? Or sometimes you even need to look, are we going to even embrace that new technology? Is it something that's vital to my organization? Is it worth the investment? Is it worth it for us? I mean, I don't think, we can argue cloud hasn't been, cloud is important for companies. IoT is important. I think I haven't seen one that hasn't been adopted, but, that's the first thing a company really needs. Somebody needs to think about when they're looking at their structure. Is this even something that I want to do? And then if they do, again, they need to to look at that governance structure and figure out where it fits in and make the changes that are necessary.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Another area that I think is quickly taking shape is the role of automation.
Yeah.
And even data-driven decision-making in governance. Organizations are looking at business intelligence and all kinds of stuff to help them run their business. How do you think these are going to impact risk management and maybe even compliance efforts? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, again, with the risks, our risks are changing.
Yep.
Right? So you need to, again, have that continual look at your risk and do continual risk assessments and decide what is the appropriate cadence for your organization as to when to do those. But you're going to continually need to look at the risks. There's new risks that come about with the new technologies. People, as we shifted to having a lot more at-home employees, right? The environment changes the risks. And I do think that those, you're going to, as with anything, I think we just need to somewhat keep up, but then to Altan's point earlier, try to stay ahead of it as much as we can. You don't want to always be in the reactionary mode. And I think our skills have developed and people are anticipating a little more of what's going to happen and they're anticipating risks. And I think the IT governance structures will also evolve, to respond to those new risks, new technologies, new people, new culture.
Yeah. So, Katherine, I wanted to get your thoughts on the composition of governance team, be it internal, maybe full-time governance teams that help shepherd the various IT teams, maybe the business teams as well, in terms of getting them converged on a common goal, or maybe with a project to make sure that everybody's in alignment and all that, and then keeping that maintained, or maybe a consultant group coming in as the governance advisors, consultants, or even auditors. So what are your thoughts on the ideal composition of a governance team? And then what do you think, I know you have the background in computer science and maybe technical domains, in terms of the allocation of human capital, human resources in that group. Do you see substantial value in some of the team members having that technical chops, if you will, having certain backgrounds to be able to maybe I don't know, in terms of communication or with some technical details being conveyed, and then how that connects to the broader picture when you talk about some system needing to be aligned with a higher level of regulatory requirement, or maybe the governance structures, overall objectives. How do you see that? How do you see in terms of the maintaining a diverse set of roles within the group, if that's possible to maintain, and what is in your opinion the ideal distribution of skill sets in a well-functioning governance team, if it makes sense?
Right. The governance team, I think it's great if an organization has a committed governance team within their organization. I've seen that more and more companies are making that investment. I know, it's that fine line with trying to trim what some people view as excess staff, and then also, but having some of those internal resources that are committed to that. From a scaling perspective, you need to look at your organization and what makes sense. But I do think a very strong combination, you've obviously got to have somebody in the leadership position that can talk to senior management, and because they're going to need to facilitate some of those conversations with the key stakeholders, and then ultimately get the buy-in from that senior management. But then you need a strong technical team, and as you said, the human resource part of it, right? The org piece, and the people that are going to be able to understand what some of the human impacts are to the changes, either change in position or change in staff or less staff. You need a strong team. And in addition, I think it's always good. Some of your technical folks are going to be brilliant technically, but they're not necessarily going to be maybe the most tactful or the most approachable, or they're going to have no interest in it, right? I know IT people that never, in my career, I've worked with people that were great programmers and great technically, but had zero interest in talking to the client or the end user or the, even the outside parts of that organization. And they don't want to sit in that room with them and understand it. They just want to go off and do the analysis or do whatever we've asked them to do. And so you need a good combination of a team that can understand the people aspect of it, the IT aspect, the culture aspect, and then the, being able to manage that change. So I also think somebody that's good with change management, because I would expect in most cases that strategy or the governance structure is going to change, and you need people that can help facilitate that change as well.
Okay, so building on that,
Yeah.
since you're talking about people, you're kind of talking about skills that you need today.
Right.
What about skills for tomorrow? As the technology evolves, or as the whole governance world evolves, what are the biggest challenges you think? In other words, how do you think it's going to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years, and what skills and knowledge areas do you think professionals should be focusing on in order to be able to stay ahead?
In terms of being able to do the IT governance and that type structure, I think you'll have your true technicians that understand the technology of what's happening, because they're the ones that are going to be able to help you make sense of, does this work? Will it not work? How does that fit in from a technology perspective? But, so you're going to need technologists that stay current and stay abreast of what those evolving technologies are. But I think the human component and the change management component, for the most part, should stay the same. You still need those people. It'll be the same skill set, because they need to help you manage the changes, you implement it from a business process perspective, and then also from an organization perspective.
Do you think there are specific challenges that organizations are going to face in the coming years as it relates to governance that you're seeing kind of on the horizon?
Yeah, I would definitely say yes. There's some of the challenges I think they're going to face. I think from what I've seen and what I expect is that technology is going to keep evolving faster and faster. We've been on an almost exponential trajectory for the last 100 years. I mean, if you think it was 1950s really before the big computers were being used, we're only 75 years out. And again, we mentioned, you're carrying one in your most people are carrying one in their hand every day, and a lot of people have two, right? They have their work phone, their personal cell. And so I've lost my thought. What was the question? I'm sorry.
I was asking specifically about the challenges that you see
yes,
that organizations are facing in the governance
Yes.
world, right?
I'm sorry. Yeah. So it's, we've had such dramatic changes, and I think organizations are going to need to stay on top of that, and it's going to be more of a rapid development again. And it's going to be going from that old-fashioned development life cycle to this rapid changing, bite off little pieces, take a little piece of your IT governance structure and make that change, and then go to the next one. You're not going to, I feel like we're not going to have the time to be, to spend 6 or 8 months looking at a piece and overhauling the whole thing at one time, because by the time you get to the end of the 6 or 8 months, something's going to have changed. And so I think organizations are going to need to bite off little pieces of it, if you will, and make the change that needs to be done to the governance structure to respond to whatever, or to address whatever their current risk is that they're trying to address, or what their anticipation is, and then be ready to do it in more rapid fire, if you will.
It almost feels like we're kind of in a rat race, right? At the end of the day.
It does. It does. And I don't know how to get out of it. I don't. I mean, maybe it would be great if somebody did. I don't know the answer to it. I think it's job security for a lot of people, so that's not necessarily bad. But it can be frustrating from a personal perspective, because you feel like it's almost like firefighting, right? You can't get out of it. But it's exciting. I think the other side of it is to just embrace that is exciting, that we've got all these technologies and all this available, and the power. I mean, just with the AI and how quickly it can turn things around, and how quickly you can look at your data, and just how fast everything can happen. And, it definitely helps that instant gratification feeling that a lot of people have. So I think rather than feeling like the rat race or the intimidation, we need to embrace kind of the excitement and the power and the potential of what we have ahead of us.
A real quick follow-on question on that. Do you think, though, then that identifies for us one of the skill sets that we need to kind of be thinking about developing, which is adaptability, right? In terms of flexibility, because we can't necessarily assume that tomorrow is going to be like today.
Right. I do. I think it's something I feel like we learned even with COVID, right? With the pandemic and how we all really had to change the way we lived our lives, especially during that initial period when you were shut down and everybody was like, oh yeah, okay, I'm supposed to go this way down the grocery store aisle or whatever, just to bring an analogy into it. We have got to be adaptable and we've got to be able to respond to what's happening around us and how quickly things are changing. But again, I think embracing that change and realizing the potential is a great thing. And I do think being adaptable, I think it's a little harder, I think, for some of those that have been working for a longer time. And I know there's frustration sometimes with the older workforce and the younger workforce and how things are different. And I know corporations, it's kind of stepping away from governance, but corporations are really having to take a look at how they do business and even how they deliver their onboarding training to employees and the focus. And we've certainly talked about it even from an ISACA perspective and how we deliver our conferences and what type of structure people want. And it's a perspective that I know, Altan, you've actually brought, that people really want that I think you were the one that mentioned it. They want hands-on training. They don't want to sit and listen. Our conferences of old were very much sitting and listening to speakers, and we would be very engaged listening to what they did in their day job and listening to them for 45 minutes. And now conference attendees want something more rapid fire or quick or hands-on and testing or capture the flag type activities. And I think there is that component too, Jim, where we need to be adaptable and change. Everybody kind of needs to change, and we need to also respect where everybody's coming from. I think the older generation needs to respect the new and fresh perspectives that people bring, but then there needs to be some patience given on the other end.
Yeah, exactly. So a quick follow-on in terms of the skill development perspective, especially when we think about the leadership skills. So how do you look at the challenges that leaders are facing in terms of what skills they might be lacking and that they need to develop? And then do you see that landscape has shifted, or has it remained constant more or less in the last few decades in terms of the patterns of like lack of competencies that leads to the breakdown of even the largest organizations that we see, like in some of the more memorable cases, that leadership failures that keep constantly happening. So how do you look at that in terms of what people tend to lack, and then maybe is there a way to address that in a more systematic way? And then do you see like the evolution of the like maybe digital landscape? Does it have any substantial impact on that, on those like commonly lacked skills, or do you see it as more of a fundamental type of organizational syndrome, if you will?
I think there's a lot of answers or questions buried in that and the answers. So I do think that there are senior leaders that in some of the organizations that do need to have more awareness of what's happening on the ground in their organization. And I think it's a very hard thing because they're very intelligent, they're very driven, they're very good at what they do. But because the workforce and the landscape is changing so much, I do think there needs to be some kind of training. It's not my background. I don't know what kind of training they would need, but I do think to get people in the room together, at least getting them to understand and be on the same page would make strides for both sides, right? And I think, so some of it, you mentioned digital, I think you could take advantage of the digital landscape and some of the training that's available and try to bridge some of those gaps. And I think it's important that we continue to work at it because I think that's what's going to make the organization effective. And I don't think we can I don't think an organization can be effective if you don't have a good feeling of everybody coming together, at least and agreeing on some pretty core principles. And so then without that, and you don't have that culture, your IT governance and all those other pieces they're just not going to be as effective.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Katherine. So, if somebody were interested in kind of developing IT governance skills, do you have any guidance on training programs, certifications? What would you recommend IT professionals look at specializing in as it relates to governance?
There's a lot out there, and certainly being from ISACA, I would promote ISACA's resources. ISACA, for those who aren't members, you can join. It's a global organization with chapters around the world, and locally we have over 5,000 members. And so it's a great resource. There's opportunities to collaborate, to communicate, meet your colleagues. But in addition, ISACA globally brings the COBIT framework. They also acquired the IT Governance Institute. So from a governance perspective, there's a wealth of resources. There's blog articles. There's just training articles. There's also the certification, as I mentioned. I have they call it the C-Gates, the Enterprise IT Governance certification that you can get through ISACA. There's also there's toolkits available to you through the ISACA website as you navigate with IT governance within your organization. Certainly COBIT's a good resource. So there's a wealth of information out there. There's also all the standards and practices. You've got the NIST and ISO and all of those industry standards to look at. So there is a wealth of information. I would certainly encourage you to engage with ISACA.
All right. So, as a follow-on to that, like in terms of any specific, like maybe technical or non-technical skill development, like people can take up on their own. Do you have any views on that? Maybe independent of any certifications, or like in combination with certifications that may have some overlaps or maybe complementary characteristics. Do you see maybe? And we talked about like leadership skills, like maybe the accountability and persuasion, communication skills. Like how do you think some of the better ways to interweave those with that like specific like framework knowledge or
right
the governance structures?
I can't speak to the organizational or change management skills. I'm not as familiar with that. Certainly we could get that information for someone who's interested. You could reach out to ISACA, but there is, we do, Jim actually offers some AI classes, and we do training through ISACA. There's also certificates you can get through ISACA. ISACA used to, I believe when I joined, there were 4 certifications, and that was it. And now when you look, there's probably 10 or 12 certifications. There's also certificates. There's fundamental classes if people just want to get involved. There's also other organizations, certainly, that you could look at and get training on governance. I also think risk management is key, right? Because being able to assess the risks and knowing how to even identify the risks and then evaluate the criticality of those and what the impacts is also really important. So there's risk management classes you can do. ISACA has a risk management certification as well. So I think there's a lot of pieces that go to it. And then, as I mentioned, the AI classes and just staying current on what's, the changing technical landscape and the cloud security or IoT, staying abreast of finding what your passion is in all of that, because obviously you're not going to be able to do all of it, but figure out where are you passionate and then delve deeper into that.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about the role of volunteering in terms of professional and personal development as it ties to that?
I'm a big proponent of volunteering. As I mentioned, I've been on the ISACA board since 2014. For me, it's been a tremendous opportunity for me to grow. I've met an amazing number of people that are so talented in their different fields, and certainly none of us are experts on anything. I am also a very big proponent of give back, and so ISACA has given me so much, and the partner I had worked for was a big proponent of ISACA, and so to me it was something that I did for him initially, was joining, but it's been very rewarding. I went to a global conference in Chicago and met people, and it's very interesting. I met the president of one of the chapters on the West Coast, and it was a chapter of 40 people. And so, the needs are very different, but I still feel like at the core of it is volunteering. I volunteer with 2 other organizations outside of this, so it's kind of at the core of who I am. I know, and I just feel like there's so much that's been given to me, and it's my opportunity to give back.
That's awesome.
Okay, well, Katherine, hey, it looks like we're out of time. We want to thank you so much for joining us, and your insights have been incredibly invaluable.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Altan. Thank you, Jim.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to the Cyber Insights. It's an ISACA-GWDC radio show /podcast. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time as we continue to exploring the world of cybersecurity, IT audit, risk management, governance, and privacy. Until then, stay safe.